Thank you. And now, Les, would you introduce our speaker, please?
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Thank you, Laurie. Well, it's a great pleasure this evening to have Allan Buckwell back with us. Allan, of course, has spoken to us on two previous occasions, but on his last two appearances, he had a rather different remit, and that, of course, was Brexit, which, as Allan says, it's done and dusted, so we just get on with it and we'll see what happens. What he's going to be talking to us this evening about is, of course, really, in some ways, a slightly allied project. He comes, of course, from a background of being an agricultural economist and was a lecturer for many years. And he's a senior research fellow of the Institute of European Environmental Policy. And what he's going to be talking to us about tonight is really environmentally related, with a rather intriguing title, which of course you've already seen. So without further ado, Allan, the floor is yours. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Les. I'm just going to share my screen as I say these few words. Yes, it's a pleasure to talk to you again. It would be an even bigger pleasure if we could do it face to face and with a glass close by, but we'll make the best of it. And I hope you'll find this an interesting topic. Because what I want to talk about is a subject that, as Les says, has been given a lot of attention in the last 2 or 3 years in Britain in particular, because of Brexit, because agricultural policy and environmental policy were two of the many things that were under EU jurisdiction all the while we were members of the European Union. And these were things that are now repatriated back to Westminster. And in fact, actually, agriculture and food are devolved matters, and that makes everything more complicated because some important decisions are made in Westminster and in Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast too. But the issue is that I want to talk to you about, and I do hope that I can do this in a way that doesn't send you off to sleep or drive you off the screen. And so that we can have a discussion on this, because it's something that involves us all. It's the food system. We all eat. I can remember saying to students a very long time ago, what else do you do at least 2 or 3 times a day, every day of your life, that you enjoy doing? And generally speaking, you know, there's not many people who can think many things other than eating. It's a critical function, and it's more than a function. It's a pleasure in our lives. When we have, you know, our most important occasions in life, we celebrate usually with food and drink. And so what I want to consider is that the food system we have in Britain, it's not a lot different than the food system in Europe, but I'm talking about Britain. And we'll see that there's some big questions about how we do it and the way that we use land. So I want to take you kind of through the arguments. Just a few. Unfortunately, I can't kind of really, these facts, you won't hold them all in your head, but I'll send the presentation to anybody who wants it, to just have a few facts behind you. The UK population, 67 million. It's expected to continue growing for at least another few decades. The current projections are to grow another 9 million, that's 13% by 2050. Farmers make up a mere 1.5% of the workforce of Britain. So 1.5% of us feed the other 98.5% of us. There's about 219,000 farm holdings in Britain, a total of about 476,000 farm workers. That includes farmers and their spouses. So it's a fragmented industry. It's occupying a pretty small part of the workforce and produces just under 1% of GDP. And that already, those two figures, 1.5% of the workforce and 1% of GDP, tells you that the average productivity of agriculture is below the average productivity of the rest of the economy, which is a kind of constant issue and problem. The agricultural area of Britain is 17.5 million hectares. It takes up 72% of the total land area. That's UK. And in England, it's probably more than that. It's probably about 80% of the land area. We all think that we've concreted over the countryside. Well, we haven't. The area of settled land is about 7 or 8%. The area of forest land in Britain is about 13%. So our countryside is dominated by what we do with it for farming. And that's quite unusual. Most other European countries have got more forest cover than Britain has. We're a bit unusual in that respect. Farm size, there's a tremendous variety of farm size. What I will tell you is that the 17% of the largest holdings, that's holdings over 100 hectares, occupy about 3/4 of the area and produce about 80% of the output. There's a strong kind of 80-20 rule out there that the bulk of the output is produced by the largest 20% of producers. The food chain is enormous, and farmers like to think of themselves, and they are the base of the food chain, but in total it's enormous. The total gross value added of the British food chain is 120 billion. It's about 6.3% of gross value added in the economy. It employs about 4 million people. And the makeup of that, what we're talking about here, is the largest single sector of it is catering, hospitality. I mean, it's a sector that's been absolutely shattered by the pandemic. So you can see why this is quite a blow to the economy generally. Food and drink retailing is another 30%. And the food and drink retailing was hardly been affected by the pandemic at all. We've had to buy our food somewhere. So a lot of the food that was going through hospitality has had to be diverted through retail, which has caused various problems. Food and drink manufacturing, another 1/4 of gross value added in the food chain. Wholesaling 12%. And you see, even within the food chain, farming is a minor part. It contributes just 8% of that 120 billion of gross value added. As far as food trade is concerned, Britain is a net importer. We in a sense, we took a decision with the repeal of the Corn Laws back in the middle of the 19th century. That Britain's role in the world was outward facing, a big exporter, mostly of services nowadays. And so we had a long tradition of importing food products. And so we import about 48 billion pounds worth annually, export about 23 billion. What we import, a lot of it is stuff we can't grow here. It's beverages, tea, coffee, spices, and so on, various fruits that we can't grow here, like oranges, citrus fruit. And then what we export is mostly processed foods. Do you know what the largest export? This is all food and drink, by the way. Anyone want to shout out what the largest British food export is? It's not.
Try whiskey.
Yep, I would like to. Yes, it's whiskey. And funnily enough, the Scots do a lot of our food exporting. I'm not quite sure what the rank is, but salmon is something we export a huge value of. So that we export processed food and drink. Our self-supply is 64% overall. If you just count the things that we could grow here, we're about 77% of what we consume in Britain is produced in Britain. Expenditure on food, total expenditure on food and drink in the British economy. These figures are all from about 2018 or 19. They're all in Agriculture UK, or you can get this online easily. 106 of that 234 billion is through catering. I mean, it's getting on for half of our total spend on food and drink is what we spend outside the house. I mean, everything from the coffee bars, from the sandwich lunches, to the pubs and the restaurants and hotels and holiday and so on. So the catering industry is enormous, 128 billion at home. The average proportion of total income spent on food and drink in Britain is 10.6%. I mean, it's extraordinarily low, and a good deal of that is alcoholic drink. And then the last of the figures I'll just throw out as this sort of background to all this, the farm gate share of retail food prices. Farmers feel that they're at the sort of poor end of the deal in the food chain, and they complain they get a relatively low share of the consumer's pound spent on food. Well, the average is 41%. The range is very, very wide. For things like cereals, which are obviously heavily processed before we eat them, you don't eat wheat as it comes off the field. You eat biscuits and cakes and bread and so on. So the farm gate content of a pound's worth of bread is about 8%. Whereas for something like an iceberg lettuce, the farmer's getting 61% on average of what you pay at retail level. So how well's this system working? Well, farmers are a bit prone to grumble, and I don't blame them because they're in a very exposed industry. And for a number of reasons, they're not that happy. That's my perception. If there's any on the line who's very happy, then I'm very happy for them to say so. They're not happy because they tend to be asset rich. Land values are high. They've risen a lot even in the last 20 years, although they've stabilized and declined slightly since the referendum. But if you own your land, your farmland, which about 60% of farmers do, it's about 35% who are tenants. If you're an owner-occupier, you're asset rich and income poor. About a third of English farmers earn less than 10,000 a year from their farming. An awful lot of farmers survive because they got other occupations, or they got a spouse who's doing the real job and they're playing at farming. I hope that doesn't sound too rude, but you know, for some, farming is a way of life, and it's an occupation rather than a profession or a serious business. And there's no doubt that compared to many industries, but some others have some features of this, it's exposed to huge variability. Farming is a biological activity, raising plants and animals. If you do it yourself, you know the darn things are incredibly subject to pests and diseases. And anyone who's messed around with sheep knows the damn things are always getting ill. They've almost got a will to die. Farmers joke about that. It's not really a joke. It's a biological process dependent on the weather, on the climate, as well as markets, policy, and pests and disease. There's always plenty of things that can go wrong. And any gardener knows this. To grow blemish-free, good-sized, perfect specimens of fruit and veg year in, year out across the lot is not a straightforward task. There's always something getting at it. Which is a joy when you're a gardener, just sort of having fun doing it. But when you're making a living from it, this is a serious challenge. And farming is very fragmented. It buys from and sells to highly concentrated businesses. So upstream, it buys its genetics, its seeds, usually from and nowadays increasingly from a relatively small number of breeders producing the top quality, top yielding seeds. That's less so with livestock. They buy their machines from global tractor companies, combine harvester companies, machinery companies, milking machine companies. There's probably only 2 or 3 in the world. They buy their fertilizers. That's another highly concentrated bit of chemical engineering. Pesticides are a bit like the pharmaceutical industry, dominated by about 4 or 5 global companies that have the resources to develop new active substances to deal with plant pests and diseases and to sell them, and banks and so on. So farmers are buying from very concentrated businesses, and they're by and large selling to concentrated businesses, the food processors, the millers, the milk processors, the meat processors, and the food service sector. I mean, there are companies like Break Brothers who are very big operators and a lot of produce goes through their hands. They're purchasing from either food processors or from farmers. And the retailers are fairly concentrated too, as we know. 4 or 5 dominate the market. And food service is a mixture, obviously. There's a lot of very, very small micro businesses in food service sector, but then there are also some enormous players like McDonald's who buy a lot of beef and a lot of potatoes and can therefore call the shots on exactly what the product specification is and what the price will be. And the farmer basically takes it, it's take it or leave it. If you want to serve McDonald's, you produce to their specification or you don't sell anything. So the market power is undoubtedly not at the farm or on the farm. They're fragmented, and British farmers have been, I don't know why, again, if there's any on the line, they can perhaps explain this, compared to continental farmers, much less prone to cooperate and work together. And so as a result of these features of farming, its uncertainties, its variability, and its sort of economic position in the power chain, its rather weak position, it's found itself pretty dependent on government. It also feels increasingly over-regulated, although, as I'll point out later, I suspect they've seen nothing yet. And what you find is that production agriculture globally, generally speaking, is not a high returns business. It's a pretty marginal business, and farmers are driven increasingly. They've got to increase their throughput to produce a wafer thin margin per ton of wheat or per 100 litres of milk or whatever it is. And it's an industry, therefore, that finds itself constantly squeezed and constantly asking itself, how do we cope with this and where's the future? And yet they know, and we all know, we want them to produce forever. As long as there's humans, there's a food industry and there's a farmer. Now, there's a view of the industry from inside. What do others think? Well, let me just start by saying I would suggest to you that we, I mean the British population, but in fact the European population or the population of the developed world, is better fed and better served by a more sophisticated food industry than at any time in history. The sheer variety, reliability, and consistency of food we just take for granted. You can go to buy anywhere in any developed country, you can buy almost any food product every day of the year by not driving very far from where you live, if you live in a developed country. And you know that food its quality will be consistent, the hygiene standards, by and large, it won't poison you, it won't harm you, and you'll know exactly what you're getting because it says so on the packet. And we, in a sense, we've never had it so good, and hence what we've seen over the last century is that the proportion of our incomes we spend on food has progressively shrunk, and of that, the proportion that we've spent on food service, having it literally served to us in restaurants and cafes, which would years ago have been an absolute luxury, is now something we take for granted and expect to do multiple times. And we're all, because of COVID, dying to get out there and have a decent pub meal before long and a drink with it. And also accompanying the changes we've seen over the last century, life expectancy has steadily grown. We're better fed in every sense. And yet you can read in Britain, I could point you to half a dozen books and serious reports from serious groups of scientists who will tell you that the food system is broken. Let me just pull a couple off the shelf. Where is it? I should have rehearsed this. Where did I put it? There we go. Here's two of them. This is by a professor of economics from Oxford University called Dieter Helm, who's a very serious advisor to the government. Michael Gove listened to him carefully. Called Green and Prosperous Land, a blueprint for rescuing the British countryside. Did you all know that the British countryside needed rescuing? Well, he'll tell you that it did. Here's another book. These books published last year. Feeding Britain, Our Food Problems and How to Fix Them by Tim Lang, Professor of Food Policy at City University, London. That's just two. There's a current project going on by the Royal Society of Arts that's looking at a Food and Farming Countryside Commission. There's a project by the Royal Society, that's the sort of Britain's top scientific society, looking at, called Living Landscapes, looking at the way we're using our land, all because the diagnosis, and the words that I put in red on this slide were written last year by a national food strategy that was set up by Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for DEFRA in 2019 to look at the food system in Britain. And they produced an interim report last summer, which said in their final report, they're going to define for us a food system which does not make us and our planet sick. Now, you couldn't say it much more compactly than that. Serious scientists claim that our food system is so broken, it's making us and our planet sick, and we've got to do something about it. Now, I would guess that to most of the British public, this is news. I don't think when most people go and fill their trolley at Waitrose or Sainsbury's or Asda or Aldi or wherever you go, that's what they're doing, is buying stuff that's going to make them or the planet sick. But let me explain what's behind all this, because what people are talking about are three crises: the crisis of the climate crisis, the crisis of biodiversity that David Attenborough will tell you about every night of the week. On there's usually a program about this. And the third one is diet and health. So let me just quickly run through these. Climate. Farming is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. It's by no means the biggest. It's about 9% of British greenhouse gas emissions. So there's 91% not coming from our food system or agriculture, but 9% is. And the concern is that we know what we've got to do with the 90%. We've got to turn ourselves away from fossil fuels onto renewable energy of one sort or another. And it is the government's determination that we will eliminate fossil fuel burning by 2050 and eliminate the CO2 emissions from it, which will then leave the agricultural emissions, unless we do something, as 100% of the emissions and still emitting. So agriculture, it produces its own carbon dioxide, first of all, because like every industry, it's got machineries that burns fossil fuels, tractors, combines, and so on. It does a lot of heating, a lot of cooling, a lot of lighting. I mean, the horticulture, go and see Thanet Earth, there's quite a bit of electricity being burned there, although I think that is renewable. Secondly, when farmers disturb the soil or they drain peaty soils, essentially the organic matter in the soil oxidizes. And when carbon oxidizes, it produces carbon dioxide, funnily enough, adds to the atmospheric CO2. That's one source. The more serious sources from agriculture are methane and nitrous oxide. And the methane comes essentially from fermentation in the ruminants of cattle and sheep. I mean, cattle and sheep can make use of herbage that you and I can't eat. If we ate grass or leaves, we simply wouldn't be able to digest it. Their stomach, their four-chambered stomach, is designed, it's full of bacteria which can digest the cellulosic material that makes up grasses and herbage. But the problem is, in doing it biochemically, you can't stop the fact that you get methane produced. And that's what cows are constantly burping up. And then also the manure from animals and anaerobic conditions in the soil produce methane. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, more powerful than CO2 in terms of its warming impact. Nitrous oxide comes from the breakdown of nitrogenous fertilizer in the soil. You can't grow anything without nitrogen. I mean, most gardeners, their nitrogen is coming in the form of the compost they've added and the breakdown of previous organic matter in the soil. Farmers use manures and compost, but they also use ammonium nitrate, which is produced by the chemical industry, by the fertilizer industry. And unavoidably, in part of the nitrogen cycle in the soil, nitrous oxide comes off, and that's an even more powerful greenhouse gas. So agriculture is a significant polluter. It's not its fault. It's not to blame for this. It's just part of the biological nature and the chemical nature of what goes on in plants and in the soil. So not only is farming a polluter, but it's also highly vulnerable to climate change. It's more vulnerable than many industries. Because once the temperature gets significantly higher, you get to a stage, and it won't happen in Britain, but it will certainly happen in Spain and Greece and southern Italy. It'll simply be too hot. And so field crops simply won't grow. They'll simply dry out. Once temperature rises 2 or 3 or 4 degrees, unless you can breed varieties that can withstand that. And then with variable precipitation, without precipitation, stuff won't grow. Or if there's too much precipitation, it won't grow because it's drowned out. And so agriculture is vulnerable to changes in climate, and particularly the extreme events like frost, storm, winds, floods, drought, fire. Any of those can just ruin your crop. I mean, you saw those fires in Australia. An awful lot of farmland got burnt incidentally in those fires too. And the other thing that makes farming vulnerable to climate change is the exposure to more disease. More species are overwintering because the winters by and large are less extreme and cold. And there's a sort of movement north of various species, including pest species. And I guess most of us are aware of that in the tree diseases like ash dieback and sudden death in oak. Well, similarly in agricultural crops, there are diseases and pests that are arriving that we weren't used to before because they're finding they can survive in our climate. It should be said in passing that not all climate change is bad for agriculture. Higher CO2 levels mean higher productivity of most plants. I mean, some greenhouse producers pump CO2 into their greenhouses to increase the CO2 level, to get more photosynthesis, to get more tomatoes and lettuce grown. But that positive effect of climate change is far outweighed potentially by the damaging impacts. As far as the biodiversity crisis is concerned, what is biodiversity? Well, it's nature. It's the plants, the birds and the animals and the insects that we see. Of course, some biodiversity isn't all that popular. I had an American friend who said, biodiversity, if that means more mosquitoes, I'm not in favor of it. He wasn't being very serious. But the loss of biodiversity that we are concerned about, or farmers should be concerned about, are the pollinators, which includes bees and butterflies and a whole range of other insects. In fact, most biodiversity out there, in terms of sheer numbers of species, is in the soil. The soil is an incredibly complex ecosystem of invertebrate insects, earthworms, nematodes, microbes, fungi, hundreds, if not thousands of species of fungi, mycorrhiza, bacteria and viruses. And these are highly complex systems. And what they're doing is breaking down vegetation. I mean, every year plants grow in every ecosystem, and plant material and animal material grows, it dies, and if it wasn't decomposed by something, it would just pile up. We'd be drowned out by the waste of last year's growth. And so there's an incredible process which takes place in the soil, all soils, agricultural soils, forest soils, of breaking down the annual increment in vegetation each year. And the reason that this biodiversity is important is that it provides the ecosystem services on which all life depends. And in a way, we've felt that we've been so clever in the last century in making ourselves independent of nature, because we learned about genetics and we learned about how to make plants grow faster by throwing fertilizers on them and protecting them with sprays and pesticides, that we tended to think that we'd in a sense conquered nature. And in fact, you even find the language in some gardening books. I think this certainly happened a few decades ago. It happens much less so now, where people would talk about battling with nature rather than working with it. Well, now the vocabulary is changing. We've realized that in the process of changing our agriculture through intensifying our farming, specializing it, increasing the scale, taking out the hedgerows, enlarging the fields so we can get bigger machineries in there, much more efficient. It enabled us to bring those food prices down so that we all spend very little of our income on food. We've got lots more money to spend on everything else that we spend our money on to enjoy ourselves. But the process of simplifying and removing habitats and using these external inputs in agriculture has polluted the air, the water, the soil, the climate. And we've been warned about this for decades, and for decades, most of us, me included, poo-pooed those who were screaming the environmental case. We thought they were all nutters and tree huggers, and we had all sorts of vocabulary to insult them. I think in the last few decades, we've gradually realized they were right. We were undermining our ability to continue doing this indefinitely. And yet, clearly, that's what we have to do with the food sector. Is we need to be able to produce food indefinitely for all generations to come. So what we've realised is that the success of agriculture has come at a price to nature and the climate, or to put it in other language, farming has eroded its natural capital. It's been the unintended consequence of the structural and technical changes in farming. That universities like the ones I worked in contributed to these technologies without fully realizing what their impacts would be. Well, it's taken us decades to come to this realization, but we now have it, and the evidence is clear on biodiversity and on climate that agriculture is causing significant negative impacts. And the third crisis is nothing to do with production, it's to do with us, it's consumption. It's diet and health. We've had access to more reliable and better food than ever. And yet, and maybe because of that, we've been consuming far more carbohydrates, especially sugars and fats, especially unsaturated fats, more protein, especially animal protein, and more salt than dietary recommendations. And when I say more, not just a little bit more than the diet. If you look at the dietary recommendation for the intake of calories, protein, salt, and so on, all the basic nutrients, you'll find that most Brits on average are consuming orders of magnitude too much, like 40, 50, 60, or 70% too much of some of these ingredients, some of these nutrients. And we're consuming too little fruit and vegetable. And so there's too little dietary fiber. Now, dietitians will argue till hell freezes over about what's the ideal diet. I mean, it's one of these subjects that we go on about forever and a day, but there's no doubt whatsoever that we're over-consuming on these macronutrients. And the result is all too obvious. And Britain is at in a sense, the bad end of the scale. It's not the worst in Europe, and it's not the worst in the world, but it's certainly, there were some figures last week that put us about, I've forgotten what rank we were in Europe, 5th or 6th or some worst for the proportion of the population who are overweight and obese. 33%, and what's more, the more deprived sectors of our population suffer this the worst. 33% of the most deprived group in England are obese. And these are not just lifestyle choices, these have real impacts on life expectancy and life quality. These lead to significantly higher risk of type 2 diabetes, which has increased enormously in the last 20 years, the incidence of coronary heart disease and certain cancers. And so life expectancy has stopped rising and beginning to fall. The insurance industry and the pension industry think this is marvelous. It's going to, their funds might go further than they thought, but it's because people are dying earlier. And the fact this is not just sort of fanciful, cranky theories of one or two people. We've seen it in the figures for COVID deaths, that the morbidity or the mortality of those, number one is your age, number two is if you're overweight or obese or with type 2 diabetes, you had a much higher probability that if you got COVID-19, you would die from it. You would not be saved. So I mean, there's a lot of life has been lost out of the 125,000 or so people who've died so far from this horrific pandemic, because they followed a lifestyle over the last 30 or 40 years which didn't do them much good. And so this is immense cost to those individuals, their families, and of course society. Obesity costs the NHS about 6 billion a year. Why? Well, it's not straightforward, and there isn't a single or simple solution to any of this. It's sedentary lifestyles. We do less physical work, less exercise, most of us, the way we shop, the way we cook, the way we eat, the massive rise in processed and ultra-processed foods, and sugar addiction comes on at a very early stage. And I feel ashamed. I mean, I've done the same thing to my own granddaughters. That it's just the simplest thing in the world, you know, to buy them a sweetie. It's you think you're doing them good, and in fact, you're leading them down a path of a not very healthy diet. And of course, food and alcohol are incredibly enjoyable and cheap. Who's to blame? Well, I don't think there's any point in trying to answer this. Everyone's to blame, and everyone will have to contribute to doing something about it. And we won't until we're convinced that we need to. So what are the ideas for putting all this right? This is a huge topic of research. Let me go through this one first reasonably thoroughly. In my view, the group who's thought most seriously about this and what we should do about it is the Committee on Climate Change. And we have in Britain and across Europe now an ambition to be net zero 2050, which means that emissions in all sectors that can should be zero means zero within 30 years from now. Agriculture is allowed to be an exception to that because eliminating those greenhouse gases that I listed for you is difficult. We can get rid of the CO2 by doing the same things everybody's got to do, moving away from fossil fuels for our heating, lighting, and transport. But the methane and nitrous oxide are very difficult to eliminate all the while you're producing food, and we will be producing food. And so the answer is what we've got to take account of is that agriculture is the only sector that can sequester carbon. It's called photosynthesis. It's the process that all plants do. They take CO2 out of the air and they make plant tissue, like trees, for example. And so what the Climate Committee says is, of course, we've got to put agriculture, land use change and forestry. That last little group, land use change and forestry, are known in the trade as LULUCF. It's the first letter of each of those words. And there's three things you've got to do for agriculture and LULUCF. We've got to reduce the agricultural emissions as much as possible. And they say we should target to reduce them by 60% in the next 30 years. That will be difficult. I think it's right to have that target. It's going to be difficult to achieve it. Secondly, we've got to release land from agriculture. We've got to take land out of agriculture and switch it to forests, peat restoration, which means essentially stop draining peat, block up the drains and re-wet it so that it becomes a sink for carbon instead of a source. And perhaps bioenergy, where we produce short rotation coppice to produce wood chip to put in boilers, where the intention is we'll eventually have carbon capture and storage. So they're saying, take land out of agriculture. Well, what are we going to eat? If we take land out of agriculture, how are we going to feed ourselves? And their answer is, we've got to reduce consumption. No avoiding this. Two reasons: for health, which I've just explained, but for environmental reasons too, because we need the land more to store carbon than we do to produce food, because we're overeating. And this extends not just Britain, across Europe, across all the developed world. I mean, look at pictures of even countries like Mexico, where obesity is at horrific levels. It's not just the richest countries that have this problem of over-consuming. And there's massive food waste too. We've got to do something about that. So that's what the climate science people say we have to do. It's not easy, but you can see that there's a combination of measures there that that sort of hang together and make sense. The biodiversity folk, they say they accept we've got to tackle climate change, so we've got to take land out of agriculture. Their solution to the way we do our agriculture is they say we've over-intensified, so the solution must be to de-intensify. And so the language you hear them talking about is we've got to move to agroecology or regenerative farming or nature-based farming or organic farming. Those are sort of labels that are attached to it. And these are systems which depend on natural processes, don't use mineral fertilizers, pesticides, antibiotics, and disturbing the soils, do use long rotations, cover crops, legumes, mixed farming, and incorporating organic matter, manure, compost. Now that's fine, those systems exist and there are lots of enthusiasts for this sort of producing. I mean, organic foods and farming is out there. You can always buy an organic version of almost every product, but what you'll notice is at least 20 or 30 or 40% more expensive. And its yields are lower. That's how the farmers can produce it and make a living still, is because they're going to get higher prices because some people are prepared to pay a premium price for those products. So what they're saying is that's the way we have to move our agriculture. Now, most conventional farmers shudder at all that lot. They shudder at land coming out of agriculture. They shudder at being told you've got to stop using fertilizers and crop protection chemicals, because from their perspective, that's what's enabled them to make money and to get high yields. And so there's got to be a complete sort of change of mentality if this is going to move in that direction. What most farming organizations want to do is to go in the opposite direction, to further intensify. The environmentalists will say, you mean more of the same, more of the stuff that's just destroyed nature. You want to do a bit more of it, with a bit cleverer technology. Well, that's the debate that's taking place. The farmers say, well, we can do a lot more precision farming with digitized, robotic, computer-driven, GPS-controlled equipment. We can put exactly the right nutrient, exactly the right place at the right time, and only the amount of pesticide that's necessary when the bug is there and has to be removed, and we can be much more precise. Now, I don't have any doubt they can be, and that this can lead to a significant reduction in pesticide use and more efficient fertilizer use. But I don't think it can eliminate those problems. That these processes are inherently leaky and not very efficient because it's biology. It's not chemistry or engineering. And they also, there's a lot of hope that gene editing is going to enable us to build resistance into plants. My view on that is if it can, why would you not do it? There are other developments moving towards vertical farming and so on, but I'm going to rush on and get to the end of the story. Clearly, if we're going to change the food system in the ways that I'm talking about, taking land out of agriculture, putting it into carbon storage and into more space for nature, somebody's got to pay for this, and we've got to send very different signals to our farmers. And the way that the agricultural policy that's going to replace the Europe's agricultural policy is moving exactly in this direction. It's going to set up a new system of environmental land management schemes to pay farmers to farm, to manage the environment and produce the ecosystem services that they've been destroying unwittingly for the last few decades. There's also a hope that every new development, housing development, road development, whatever, that destroys biodiversity will have to pay some farmer somewhere to provide a net biodiversity gain, and that this will provide a stream of funding to pay land managers to better manage land. But there's still many big questions to deal with that array of problems that I've talked about. Are we prepared to regulate the food industry? I think it's unavoidable. They've become very skilled at enticing us into appalling diets. And I think that they're not going to change this without being pushed quite heavily, I think, collectively. Are we going to switch taxation towards environmental taxation? Polluter pays taxes. rather than taxing income? These are big questions. And government procurement in the food sector could do a lot more. So pulling this together, what I'm suggesting to you is that our food system is not sustainable. This is what scientists are telling us. It's too leaky and damaging. And our diets are damagingly unhealthy too. And we therefore got to change the food system and land use. We can't do it overnight. We're talking about changes that will have to be phased in over the 2 or 3 decades to come, and particularly to achieve the climate targets. Less land for agriculture, more land for carbon and for nature. De-intensify some land use, but I think we'll have to intensify some other, because we will want to feed ourselves and we'll want farmers to earn a living, and they're struggling now. Consumption per capita is going to have to fall. It does worry me. It's easy to say that. It's much more difficult to bring it about. Some of these trends are already out there. People are eating less meat now. I mean, that's a well-established trend. Most people agree that food is too cheap, because it's not paying for the environment. And yet you can imagine the political struggle of trying to reverse that. Who's going to go to the electorate and say, vote for me and I'm going to put your food prices up? I'm going to make you pay the proper price for food. You're going to have to pay the proper price for your energy, and you will do. You've got no choice about it because it's going to be renewable energy. Well, the argument is we may have to do the same for food too. So you may find that you have to spend a bit more than 10% of your income to feed yourself in the future, that you've never had it so good as now. Are we willing to take on these changes? And in a way, this is an open question, and that's why I wanted to put it to you. So what do you think? End of story from me. Thank you for your attention.
Well, there's a question, Alan. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm sure there'll be loads of questions coming up. So the usual way, if you've got a question, please just raise your hand either physically on the screen or using the little icon that you can find at the bottom. And who have we got for a question, please? Richard Field. Yes, Richard, off you go. And then Peter.
Thanks, Alan, for giving us quite a thorough run through there. The big thing that has sort of been the direction for agriculture was the being self-sufficient after the Second World War, and being able to, rather than being held to ransom as we had been, was to be totally self-sufficient. And that was through leadership at the time to actually stand up and say that. If we're now moving to, and I understand all the environmental issues and what they're wanting farmers to do, but that needs to be led somewhere. If you are wanting to take this big step to physically reduce the amount of produce that we're actually producing and pay for that land use to be used in other ways and not food, and do you see anybody physically being able to stand up and do that within government?
Yeah, Richard, that's a good question, and it's an absolutely natural question, and anybody of our generation and older knows all too well exactly where you're coming from there. You're right, and the farmers will quite reasonably pose that question. In other words, is it dangerous to be talking about, because these land use changes can be quite straightforwardly incentivized. If the government decides we want farmers, they're not going to be taking arable land and putting it into forests. I mean, this reforestation is going to mostly take place in the uplands, and it's mostly going to be fairly rough grazing lands that are not producing a very good income level for the people who are there, the sheep and beef farmers, because that's all you can grow there. And it's going to be inducements to persuade them to plant trees. And the problem is, you know, a farmer, he doesn't want to plant trees because there's no income for about 70 or 80 years. What's he going to live on? So you've got to put in place a guarantee. You've got to pay him to change his land use, and some sort of payment regime to pay for the carbon that he's going to be storing, or these services. Now, your question is, if we do that on a significant scale, we take land out of agriculture and we de-intensify agriculture, we're going to run out of food domestically. I think everyone who is promoting exactly those measures realizes that argument, and what they say is that's first of all why we've got to reduce consumption per head. We've got to be serious about that, and we've got to do it for health reasons, reduce waste, reduce the overconsumption, which is leading to ill health, because it's having environmental negative impacts too. So you've got to make that happen. If you don't, if you have the will to take land out of agriculture, reduce intensity of agriculture, produce less in Britain, and we don't reduce consumption, then we'll simply suck in more imports. And what will be the effect of those imports where they're produced? The answer is the same biodiversity loss and the same greenhouse gas emissions. So you've achieved nothing. So I think all concerned with this debate realize that argument. You can't have leakage. That we've got to do this and not suck in more imports. So you have to make it credible. A, that you're going to reduce consumption, because without that, this story is going nowhere. And B, that you're going to induce farmers to change what they're doing. And they won't do those, they won't make those changes if they can't see these things adding up. So I think the issue about food security and U-boats, I think that genuinely is not an issue. Our food supplies, most of our food supplies that we import come from the rest of the EU. Now, there's been more than a small hiccup because of Brexit, but I assume within months and over the years to come, we'll smooth that over. We'll find a way to continue our trade with Europe. They want to export the stuff to us, we want to buy it. But so the issue about literally running out of food is not an issue. We'll run out of energy and security and various other services long before we run out of food, because we're overeating anyway. So nobody's going to die through a shortage of food. So the argument, to my mind, that you put, Richard, is to convince the farming industry that they've got to do these changes for their own good and for the good of the nation, and that we've got a package of measures that are coherent. At the moment, that's plainly the farmers are not convinced of this, and neither are the industries that supply them.
Thank you, Alan. That's a very comprehensive answer. I've got, I think, Peter Joyner, you have put your hand up. Did you, Peter? You're muted, Peter.
Yeah, no, not. Alan, thanks very much for a most comprehensive and interesting talk full of detail. What I'd like to know, though, is if you say the population is projected to go up 9 million and you're going to get rid of agricultural land, how are you going to feed this 9 extra million? Or are they all going to be super thin and very fit?
A 9 million increase in population is a 13% increase if consumption per head dropped 20%, because we consume less. If you look at livestock production, the amount of land, we're using about 60 or 70% of our agricultural resources to produce livestock. We've increased our livestock consumption in the last 40 years by about 40 or 50%. When you were a child, were you under consuming protein? Were your muscles not working because you weren't getting sufficient protein? And the answer is your muscles were working perfectly then, and you had well enough protein in your diet. And we have to move away from livestock protein by some significant extent, 20 or 30 or 40% over a period of time. It won't happen suddenly. And go back to the kind of diets we had 30 or 40 years ago, which were perfectly healthy for a healthy, active life. And more of that protein will come in the form of plants. And so therefore you can contract the agricultural area because you're not feeding animals. You've got to produce about 8 kilograms of energy into a beef animal to get 1 kilogram of meat. I mean, it's a very inefficient process. No industrialist would choose a process that inefficient, but that's the way we're stuck with the way nature is. And it's very inefficient when humans derive an excess of protein from livestock. We're talking about dairy and red meat mostly here. Pigs and poultry are much more efficient.
Thank you. David Millen, please.
Thank you, Alan. As always, a very interesting presentation. Can I ask you about genetically modified foods? Because it's possible for science to develop foods that are drought resistant, can improve yields. banned by the EU. Isn't Brexit an opportunity for us to embrace that technology?
Yes, and I suspect we will. I've some groups take the view that manipulating the genotype of our plants is inherently dangerous, and they don't go any deeper than that, than to say it shouldn't be done. We do it. I mean, we've just done it in a most astonishingly successful way in producing vaccines for COVID-19 using exactly these gene editing techniques that plant breeders want to use in order to find disease-resistant plants and animals. But let's just stick with plants for the moment. But some people will take a principled kind of ethical stance against that. I think that's a minority, and I suspect in Britain that we will be more encouraging to these developments. Don't think they're a panacea, though. My view is that because I started out as an agricultural scientist, so in a sense, I'm instinctively in favour of using all the scientific knowledge we have to produce not only medicines to keep us fit and healthy, but in a sense to produce plants and animals that we're going to eat to make them fit and healthy and productive. So I think there's a consultation on gene editing. It's quite limited. It's saying only the gene editing techniques that could produce something that could happen in nature. So it's not talking about genetic modification. It thinks that's probably let's get gene editing that doesn't involve introducing into a plant genes from an organism that couldn't possibly have got in there by nature. Let's use it in a more limited way first to get through the first stage of this. And most scientists are in favour for this, and so I'm with them on that. So I think yes, it will be a contribution, and it will be one small token benefit potentially from Brexit, except it will bring with it a trade problem because they won't accept our stuff.
Yes, thank you. I've got Brian Maxted and then Brian Willis. Brian Maxted, please.
Yes, thank you. And yes, thank you, Alan, very much indeed. We've been talking about the UK, we've been talking about Europe, but surely this is a worldwide, a global problem. How are we going to really achieve this globally?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I mean, obviously we've got to start where we live. And in a way, you know, I don't discount that the UK and Europe are exemplars in a number of areas for the world. I mean, and you can be absolutely sure that the same voices that are making the arguments that I've been making about climate, biodiversity, diet, and health are saying exactly the same thing in the US and in China too. I mean, the Chinese have realized that climate change is real. And that what proportion of their population live below sea level or within 1 or 2 meters of sea level, and that given their population that they want to feed, they know these problems are coming too. So that you're absolutely right. This is a global issue, and in a sense, the analysis fundamentally won't be very different around the world, although some details are undoubtedly are different. You know, how much scope there is for forestry will vary enormously from country to country. We have a significant scope to grow forests. We've got a significant scope to store carbon in peaty soils because we've got a lot of peat in the uplands of England, Scotland, and Wales. And they can be massive, you know, suitably managed over a long period. It takes decades to change this, but these are decade-long processes. We can do that. Not every country's got those sorts of soils, so every country will have its own version of it. But the essential story of reducing overconsumption. I mean, even the rich Chinese are now over-consuming meat. You don't need the meat. I mean, we do it because we enjoy it. Well, there's lots of plant-based alternatives. You know, the food industry is incredibly imaginative, and we can produce incredibly tasty plant-based variations on burgers and a lot of the meat we eat. And incidentally, what do you think of cultured meat? Stuff that comes out of a laboratory, out of a pure industrial process. I mean, it's based on living cells, but fermented in vats in the desert somewhere. And that could replace a lot of burger meat.
Yeah, you wouldn't notice the difference, would you?
No, probably not. The time it's got a few chilies in it and some spices and some onion and so on, you're right, it wouldn't. And what's wrong with that? And they can make the texture the same.
Yeah. Greetings across the pond to sunny Florida, Brian.
Hello. Yeah. Fantastic review. Thank you so much. You mentioned, of course, the work on vaccines where our chemical biologists have turned things on their head. And you talked about peat as carbon dioxide. You talked about vaccines and how chemical biologists have turned things on their head in terms of finding a cure. You talked about peat as being an absorbent of carbon dioxide. I wonder what you thought about the future of carbon oxide sequestration and perhaps reaction like methane to remove them from the atmosphere. And if you need energy, of course, you've got the splitting of water on the horizon. I mean, it seems to me that this would turn the whole problem on its head. Was that better?
Yes, it was. It's clear. You know, I think maybe you've read, well, the most recent book I've read is Bill Gates, who I spent the 1990s cursing about with his bloody Microsoft Windows. And I'm very glad I switched to Apple, but I now realize he's a very clever man. He's a technologist, and he believes very strongly that there are technical solutions out there. And what's more, he's prepared to put his billions behind them. So he's putting a lot of money into new generation nuclear fusion reactors, as well as fission. And he's also, he speaks encouragingly about air capture, which is, I think, what you're talking about. Let's use some big picture engineering solutions to extract CO2 out of the atmosphere. I'm not a physicist and I'm not an engineer, so I've no idea.
It will work for the nitrogen oxides just as well.
But from what I've read, we're so who knows? If you can do it, then okay, get on and do it. So why would we object? Although you have to think very carefully about unexpected and unintended side effects of whatever you're doing. I've certainly read others to say that these big geoengineering approaches, they're so far from the scale of operation that we currently have that they're simply not going to contribute. Particularly the direct removal of CO2. Now, with the nitrogen gases, I don't know. I've not read how they get extracted from the atmosphere. I don't know what the process is. I don't know what the chemistry is. But I think once you move into those solutions which involve changing the solar radiation coming into the earth and so on, reflecting it back, once you're moving on to those scales, I can see the argument that if everything else isn't working and the climate crisis is worsening, and you're starting to talk about, significant scale of human suffering, unless we do something quick, then in those circumstances, I think you've probably got to try almost anything. But I don't think we're there at the moment. And so the first best solutions are get yourself off fossil fuels. I mean, I think we're making incredible progress in the last 5 or 10 years on that. I think those lessons have now been taken on board. Most people accept that. So that even the solar array at Graveney is going to get built. And I think quite rightly, if we can't build one there, where the hell can we? So I think that won't please everyone. None of this will please everyone. But the point is, neither does climate change please everyone. And so I think that making huge steps during this decade on removing fossil fuels and seeing that the current rates of reduction in emissions that Britain, for example, is achieving can be taken up elsewhere and accelerated before you start indulging in. You should do the research on the things you're talking about. but I don't think we're ready to roll them out. But I'm not sufficiently informed. But I am trying to read it a lot.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, Alan. I think we got time for one more question. Georgina, I see your hand up.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, for a very interesting follow through on all those points. I want to move away from the high science now and go back to the consumer. And you mentioned waste. It seems to me that a huge amount of overproduction takes place because the supermarkets in particular insist on such perfect vegetables, fruits, what have you, to display and to sell to us. And when I was a child, you know, you ate an apple that didn't look absolutely perfect and maybe had a blemish, and it tasted perfectly all right, and it did you just as much good as a perfect apple did. So do you think that we're going to have to, or it seems to me that we ought to realize that there's an awful lot of very good food that goes to waste just because it doesn't look perfect?
Yeah, it is. That is an issue. There's no doubt it's an issue that we've kind of lulled ourselves into this perfection and blemish-free everything and perfect shapes, and so everything that doesn't match up to that, the supermarkets just, it gets graded out. It's not all wasted. I mean, there is a lot of waste in the food processing sector, but in fact, I think there's more from when it leaves the supermarket to when it comes into our own fridge management and meal management and so on. And it's fairly deep, and it's not just in British food culture, but in food cultures in many places of the world, that you offer people more food than they really need, because you don't want the opposite. You don't want to seem to be mean and to be underfeeding them. So we always provide for more than we need, and we waste such phenomenal amounts of it. Now, a lot of the food waste now, at least we're collecting it and we're getting you know, pretty crude energy out of it. It's a shockingly extravagant way of producing a bit of biogas by collecting all this food waste, but it's better to do it than not to do it. But you're right, the supermarkets could do more, but ultimately, I don't think it's the supermarkets who foist these things on the consumers. I think it's that they just, you go and talk to the supermarket buyers and the supermarket managers, and they'll say they put out 2 trays of apples, one that's perfect, and a bin that's a little bit, got a tiny bit of scab, just to see what the tolerance is, and the scab ones are still there tomorrow and the day after and the day after. Now they will go back and they'll go into juicing, I hope, or into something. But it's us ultimately. It's until, and this is why, in a sense, it's soluble because it's individual, but then it's very easy to lose heart when you realize that changing everybody's behavior is so difficult to do. But I think this is why the food procurement, government procurement, I mean, they procure a significant chunk of the total food that goes through the system. So, I mean, there's a lot that can be done through that route.
Thank you, Alan. That's sounds like a really good point to draw a close to the questions there. And time's getting on. Thank you very much, everybody. And back to you, Laurie.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Alan, for that another thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much. And can I call upon Brian Maxid to give the club's vote of thanks? Brian.